Hello, everybody. Welcome back to a new episode of PoliticsEh. I'm here again, not just by myself. I'm here with Dr. Basso. If you want to introduce yourself and kind of who you are.
Sounds good. Thank you, Aiden. My name is Dr. Andrew Basso. I teach in the Department of Political Science, and I'm affiliated with the Laurier Institute for the Study of Public Opinion and Policy. As well, I am a fellow at the Basso School of International Affairs, and my research is generally about political violence, so genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Human rights, and specifically the crime of domicide or the destruction of homes, and transitional justice, and specifically reconciliation in Canada.
Yeah, and you've written like a few books as well.
Yeah, I have. So I have a book on domicide that I co-authored with Bree Atkinson, who's a faculty member at Laurier and Faculty of Social Work, and that came out in 2022. And again, that's on the crime of domicide, which is the intentional destruction of homes as a tool of political violence. And that one has picked up actually quite a bit of traction internationally, and we presented to the UN General Assembly. And
That's really cool.
Yeah, there are talks about maybe criminalizing domicide as an amendment to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So that's one part of my research. And then the other part, one of the other parts, I had a book come out last year, and both of them are with Rutgers University Press, on displacement atrocities, or how perpetrators or why perpetrators of atrocity crimes use forced displacement as a method of annihilating populations. And then I have a book coming out next year to round it all off with Dr. Andrea Perella, who also teaches in the Department of Political Science, and that one's on settler orientations towards reconciliation and Indigenous issues in Canada.
Yeah, and that's kind of what we're going to focus a bit on today is like reconciliation in Canada, because it's a topic that I feel like was talked about a lot and then has kind of faded and isn't really talked about too much anymore. And you brought up just before we started about the Liberal leadership debate and how it got like 90 seconds of coverage and wasn't really talked about at all. And so clearly it's not top priority for these politicians and even the public eye at the moment. But like it obviously still should be. So I just kind of wanted to get you on here to like kind of talk about that and get your perspective for people who don't really understand.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, reconciliation is one of those very open processes that we have in politics right now that I think people know enough to know about reconciliation, but it's not talked about in the depth that it needs to be in order for any sort of real change to take place. The Liberal leadership, like we were talking about previously, it had 90 seconds of coverage during the debate, which is, I mean, it's laughable. It's sort of a checklist approach to morality.
Yeah.
And just saying, yep, we care about Indigenous nations, we care about reconciliation. Sure, there's my check mark, on with the business meeting. And that certainly is the problem with land acknowledgements right now too. That I can't tell you how many theater plays I go to. I love going out to the Stratford Theater. I'm a Jays fan. For better or for worse. It seems like all my sports teams are stuck in a hellhole of mediocrity all the time, but that's okay. And wherever I go, there's always some sort of a land acknowledgement, and it's often said with sincere thought, but then it's on with the business meeting.
Yeah.
Or it's on with the theater, or it's on with the ball game, and nobody really gives it a second thought. So my problem with reconciliation now is that it appears that it's just been reduced to some sort of discursive act and a platitude at best. So, yeah, why don't we unpack that a little bit today?
Yeah, I think like for me, I grew up with like in the public school sector of reconciliation becoming like a thing that we need to talk about. And like it just became like, I remember every morning, especially in like high school, we would do a land acknowledgement and then O Canada, or the other way around. I think it was a land acknowledgement first, but it was just like, oh, it's just another thing at the beginning of the day. And like we would sometimes do them at like events and stuff like that, but it does really feel like just a checklist of like, oh, we just have to get this done and then we can move on with everything else. And it makes you think about it, but then it gets to a certain point where you just don't hear it anymore and you kind of just tune it out of like, okay, yeah, we just have to like, oh, we're going to do the land acknowledgement at the beginning of this and like whatever. And nobody really cares about it because that's all it is you're just, oh, we're on Indigenous stolen land. Okay, let's continue what we're doing.
Yeah, pretty much. There's something in political opinion that's called issue salience. And issue salience means that when a great number of people are talking about something in politics, then there's a good chance that something will be done about it. And you can operate on a 50 plus 1 rule in terms of public opinion, that 51% or 50 plus 1% of people think something. Therefore, you have a mild majority, if you will, or a minor majority. But there's also the other problem of oversaturation that you're alluding to. And especially with oversaturation with little meaning behind it.
Yeah.
That's why I said reconciliation. I think one of the biggest problems with it is that it's just been reduced to something that we speak about, and we don't necessarily follow through on the concrete actions. One of the great failures of the Justin Trudeau Liberal Party has been their failure to capitalize on the momentum of the release of the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. And it released its executive summary in June 2015, and it released its full final report, all 6 volumes, 5 or 6 volumes, sorry, that's escaping me right now, in December of 2015. And it lays it all out for the residential school system, what happened, why, what the effects were, what we should do about it, importantly. That's those 94 calls to action. And those 94 calls, they include everything from the little reconciliations, if you will, of the interpersonal reconciliations between and among people, all the way to broad-based institutional reconfigurations, because the harm that is being done was done and is still being done to Indigenous nations and Indigenous peoples on the individual basis. It's institutional in nature, that it's not just like there's one smoking gun or one bad guy we can point to. It's part of the settler colonial process itself, which is woven into the very fabric of Canada. So the great failure of the Trudeau Liberals to capitalize on that momentum and that feeling of change in 2015, and the reduction of reconciliation, that's a major problem that we are left with 10 years after the release of the final report. The sort of the political sleight of hand, as I'm calling it lately, of major political figures to transform institutional reconfigurations into only Indigenous language revitalization programs. It's truly something to stand in awe at. It's a truncation of fundamental justice efforts into something that is important. Indigenous language revitalization for sure, but it's not everything, and that's only just 1 or 2 of the calls in those 94 calls. So we have sort of a wicked problem, as it's called in public policy literatures, on our hands. That it's a problem of which way is up, which way is down, which way is good, which way is bad. Unfortunately, we're spinning right now.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe the reason that it's not the main focus anymore, and that we didn't, or that the government didn't capitalize on the momentum as much, is because there were a bunch of new problems, we can say, that they needed to focus on? You can point at like 2020 and COVID, and then just everything that has happened after that, like all of the stuff that came out of that, not just COVID, but like Black Lives Matter and the economy, and just all of the things that have happened since. Do you think that that has played a really big part in that, of people being like, well, they've just kind of shifted their focus from like focusing on reconciliation to like, oh, we have other fires we need to put out, and then just kind of not worrying about that at all?
Yeah, it's sort of fire du jour, if you will. That there's always going to be a political problem that pops up. And there's always going to be something that diverts our attention. In the years before 2021, particularly, that's when the ground penetrating radar at the Kamloops, former Kamloops residential school, identified a potential unmarked grave. So we can unpack that language later on if we have time. But before that moment, nobody's really talking about reconciliation either. I mean, it's surprising to me at how fundamental reconciliation is to the functioning of this country, and to the personal, and to the interpersonal and intercommunal relationships we have. It's sort of amazing how how quickly we diverted our attention onto other things.
Yeah.
The economy obviously trumps everything. The old Bill Clinton advisor, James Carville, he said, it's the economy, stupid. Healthcare in Canada, clearly one of those major things that we care about. So COVID definitely derailed a lot of attention.
Yeah.
And frankly, other social movements, there's always room to tackle multiple competing social justice issues or fundamental justice issues at the same time. But you have to make your elected representatives feel like they have to tackle those issues. It's not enough to just black out your social media page and say, look how great I am.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just wear an orange T-shirt one day of the year. You actually have to follow through. One of the old thinkers that I often rely on here is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Have you ever heard of him?
I don't think so. It sounds weirdly familiar, but I've been like studying for midterms and everything, so I don't know. It's
That's
all kind
fair.
of everywhere. So
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he was an old Lutheran theologian, and the theological dimension of it, one could argue, is his conceptualization of cheap grace, of people preaching all the values, and from his standpoint, all the values of being a good Lutheran, being a good Christian, but only doing so to just appease some higher authority in order to gain salvation. That's cheap grace for Bonhoeffer. It's not doing the thing for the right reasons.
Yeah. Okay.
So what we need is sort of a more expensive grace, if you will, on a political level. That we need people to not only be aware of issues, but become involved in issues, and really at the bare minimum level, they need to not stand in the way. And more at the maximal level, they need to forward these issues, either individually, at the community level, at the municipal, local, provincial, federal levels, whatever it may be. But everybody does have a role to play, and we are all playing a part in this thing called transitional justice.
Yeah, and I think there's a few concepts that I think we can, or you can, kind of define for everybody listening, like. What is reconciliation? What does that actually mean? And what is transitional justice that you just mentioned?
Sure. Why don't I tackle TJ first? So transitional justice, it's a relatively new branch of largely the social sciences, but also law, the humanities. Transitional justice is at the core of sort of a cheap and nasty definition of it would be the process of moving from rights violating rule to rights respecting rule. So all about human rights here. So when you think about efforts of transitional justice, there are four main categories of tools that you can use here. One is legal proceedings that you could hypothetically place former perpetrators on trial. So the flaming example of this is the International Military Tribunal held at Nuremberg for 20 of the most highest-ranking Nazis.
Yeah.
You also have then zonal trials in the American, the British, and the French zones of occupation, as well as trials to a degree in the Soviet zone of occupation for other members of the Nazi bureaucratic apparatuses. Legal justice is pretty straightforward, that it's not an eye for an eye justice, so lex talionis. It's matching a rights violation with rights vindication through a balancing of justice through the courts. They can be costly procedures to do, not only in terms of money, but also in terms of political capital, that it can divide a society even further when you put people on trial, because there will be supporters of the former regime there. So they may not be cheering for the scales of justice to work in the correct moral way.
Yeah.
Moreover, with a legal prosecution, you may not get the full truth. Enter into truth commissions. That's mechanism number two. Truth commissions, you will probably not get prosecutions of former regime members. That's important to note right away. So there's a trade-off here. But a truth commission, it's typically comprised of a committee of specialists. I'm hesitant to use the word experts, but specialists. And they are given a mandate sometimes a judicial mandate to actually subpoena people like South Africa and the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or given a non-judicial or post-judicial mandate like Canada did, where the TRC here did not have subpoena power, which greatly hampered efforts to get the full story about the residential schools, because we could not haul former perpetrators in front of a tribunal and ask them questions.
Yeah.
In South Africa, the subpoena, it was also paired with immunity. So if you testify to everything that you did that was politically violent to uphold the apartheid system, then you will be given immunity for those crimes. Canada had no such mandate. But typically a truth commission, it's all about trying to find the truth of the past and uncovering the truth. Sometimes that is enough justice. I point us to Chile and the former military junta of Augusto Pinochet with the disappearances. Same thing in Argentina with the Dirty War, largely against leftist dissident students mostly, where people were taken in the middle of the night and their families had no idea what happened to them. The truth commissions in Argentina and Chile, they uncovered what happened to these people that were disappeared. And I really can't, I don't think there's any phrasing in English that can express how powerful this is, or any language for that. But I can't emphasize enough how devastating it is for families to really be continually hoping that their loved one who was taken in the middle of the night may actually show up at the door the next morning.
Yeah.
So the Truth Commission there was able to provide closure. So truth can set you free. You also have the simple act as mechanism 3 here of apologizing. That if somebody does wrong by you, I mean, it is pretty natural to seek some sort of apology. Now, you don't want some sort of perfunctory apology, like if you came up and hit me in the face and just said, "Oh, sorry," whatever. That's not the kind of apology I'm looking for. But if you came up and said, "I am so sorry for doing that. I did it for this reason, and I was wrong, and I'm going to not do it again."
Yeah.
So a guarantee of non-repetition, that's a great apology. Tool number 4 is reparations. That sometimes it's not enough to just say you're sorry. Sometimes you have to back it up with money or action. So sometimes it's individual reparations payments to people, and sometimes it's structural programs. So maybe development programs or community programs, whatever it may be. There are various examples of this, particularly from Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa and really all over the place, actually. But TJ, it's all about those 4 tools. So it's legal proceedings, truth commissions, political apologies, and reparations. There's no one recipe for justice.
Yeah.
That these are all just spices in your cabinet. And depending on your situation or whatever meal you're cooking here, you have to deploy whatever mechanism you think is appropriate to your society. In Canada, we decided on a truth commission. And the truth commission that we did, it's not like the other truth commissions in the world. That typically speaking, TJ, it happens after the change of a regime. That your bad regime is out, your new regime is in.
Yeah.
In Canada, you didn't have that. We still have liberal democratic rule before, liberal democratic rule afterwards. The thing that spurred on the truth process in Canada was the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement from 2006. So this was the largest class action lawsuit in Canadian history, brought forward by a group of residential school survivors, of which at the time the TRC was in operation, there were 80,000 survivors still alive out of the roughly 150,000 who were forced to attend those institutions.
Wow.
And it was by class action settlement that we got a TRC. So it's not out of political goodness necessarily. It's out of the government fighting tooth and nail to not have these stories out in the open, and survivors fighting for them to air the dirty laundry that this country has.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's pretty crazy. That's just not really talked about. That, like, I don't know. I'm from the perspective of, like, I was in school when this started happening, and, like, specifically middle school, like grade 7 is when it was just like, boom, we're talking about, like, reconciliation and the Indigenous population of Canada and learning stuff about that. I never really learned about that before. I know we talked about it before, but it was like, obviously you don't want to explain all the atrocities that happened, but it was explained of like, yeah, the people took Indigenous people, put them in residential schools. They weren't very nice. They took them away from their families. That was the bad part. And then that was it. I never really was taught until I got older and like did research of my own or just learned outside of the classroom that it was like, oh no, they died fairly often and were also not marked a lot of the time for their graves and were malnourished and not treated properly and all of these different things. And then like what happens when they went back to their family and like that, I didn't really get taught much about that. So I kind of question I have for you is like, if you were in the government at the time, at the beginning of like when all this is happening, how would you have done it differently? Like what would you have done differently? What would you have like brought forward? What would you have changed? Would you not have said like anything like that? Like kind of how would you have done it differently to do a better job at it?
Yeah. Better job of it. Don't do it at all. But you hit on something interesting there that I think too often, especially when we're talking about atrocities, people think in common parlance, oh, people didn't know any better back then.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we're imposing today's morality on the past. Oh gosh, it's just something terrible that happened. Move on. So let's unpack that a little bit. That you hit on something critical, actually, which is people had choices in all of this. Mm-hmm. That everything that was done, it's not like Canada was forced into doing these terrible things. It's that people along the way made deliberate choices. Mm-hmm. You had a series of reports all the way dating back to 1820 by Peregrine Maitland, Charles Bagot in the 1840s, Egerton Ryerson, 1840s, 50s. And then you had the Edmund Walker Head Commission in the 1850s. And then you have other governmental reports that are all aimed at this idea of Indigenous education. So for people like you and I, because we're not Indigenous, education for us, I'm sure your family has said this to you. My family said this to me. It's out there often. Education is a good thing.
Yeah.
Education is one of those things that can broaden your horizons. It really is a beautiful thing to be a part of the educational process. Education was weaponized as a method of annihilating identities.
Yeah.
And those were deliberate choices. It's not like we're talking about Indigenous education with good intentions. We're talking about Indigenous education policy to erase Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, that was one of the things that I learned about of like Indigenous children would be taken from their families, kind of forcefully taken. I think I learned that they were like, sometimes it was kind of willing of like, oh, well, they're going to go to school. That's good. But it was mostly forceful or like they kind of got tricked into it. They would go, and if they survived and came back, they would not remember the language that their entire family would speak. They would dress completely different. They would have different customs. They wouldn't remember like any of the culture that they had. So then you take them and then you give them back to their family and nobody can like understand them. They're completely different. They're a different person at that point and then aren't welcomed in. And I think that's something that like I don't know much about and didn't get taught enough about, I don't think, is like the after effects of like what happened to the people who did survive and went back to their family that then didn't recognize them at all. And like, what does that do to a person,
Well, maybe we could take a couple minutes of the conversation. I could teach you some atrocity language. So this is from my research in my neck of the woods. So, oftentimes people will say to me, you study genocide. Why would you study that? But my line has been and always will be, you get the best answers from the darkest questions. Yeah. So I don't find myself kicking at the dark. I find myself living in the dark and rummaging around in the mud that is this atrocity world with that pinhole of light at the top of the box, and that's human rights. That's the thing we have to get to. But let's talk about atrocities overall. So we have these terms, genocide and crimes against humanity and war crimes. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, they've been around for a long while. they are as legal concepts.
Mm-hmm.
Crimes against humanity, they were first used to describe the Belgian rubber tear in the Congo.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And war crimes, they are generally breaches of the laws of armed conflict. So, the 4 Geneva Conventions and its 3 annexes, as well as the multiple Hague Conventions that are out there. 2 of the main ones, maybe 3. But those things, they are all defined now in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which is a document from 1998. So Article 7 outlines crimes against humanity. Article 8 outlines war crimes. Before that, though, there's this crime of genocide. And genocide, it's a word that's entering public discourse all of a sudden yet again, likely because of all the things that are happening in the world these days that are rather dirty and naughty.
Yeah.
But genocide, the coiner of the term, his name was Raphael Lemkin, and he was a Polish Jewish lawyer, and he coined the term genocide in 1944 in his book Axis Rule Over Occupied Europe. And genocide itself is a portmanteau of 2 words. It's Greek and Latin. So the Greek word is genos, or a race, a people. And side is Latin, to kill. So genocide is literally to kill a people.
Yeah.
The legal definitions of genocide that you see right now in international law, stemming from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. It's from 9 December 1948, repeated again in full in the Rome Statute. They're limited understandings. But for Canada, there are multiple legal aspects that apply. So it's specifically Article 2, Paragraph B, which is causing serious bodily or mental harm to people. But more importantly, Article 2, Paragraph E, which is transferring children from one group to another, which basically is the residential schools at the core.
Yeah.
But on the more conceptual side of atrocity studies, we can generally divide atrocities through biological or cultural annihilation practices. That biological destruction, Raphael Lemkin initially had this term barbarism, and it was the physical annihilation of communities. That takes away the physical life force of a community. It can't reproduce. It's killed on the spot. Therefore, that community is wiped off the face of the earth. And because of that, the human community is lesser. Similarly, there's cultural annihilation, which for one of my good friends, Andrew Wolford, who teaches out at University of Manitoba, he terms as ontological destruction. And ontological destruction means to destroy somebody's essence, to destroy what it means to be a member of a group. And when you compare biological and cultural annihilation practices, I know there are people out there who go, well, real genocide is biological annihilation. To which I would say, there is really only one metric that matters. Is it genocide or not? And I say that because there is a moral equality of suffering here. Otherwise, if you pursue the other way, then we open this heartless Pandora's box of the suffering Olympics.
Yeah.
So cultural annihilation, it is very much a deeply destructive practice. And that is exactly what Canada designed to do with these residential schools. That the schools themselves, they were designed to root out Indigenous identities from children. And the choice of children was interesting. Early on in the 1820s, Peregrine Maitland, he thought that entire Indigenous communities could be made to go through this metamorphosis, this transformation into a more sedentary settler-type lifestyle.
Yeah.
He then lost faith, and then so did Charles Bagot and Ryerson especially. And they thought the only people in Indigenous communities who could make the change were children. But I will note that even these people, at the very initiation of the program, at the idea level, they did not believe Indigenous children could be full participants in a Canadian society. The residential schools were specifically designed to create a type of third-class citizen, i.e. Indigenous laborers, essentially, who would have extraordinarily gendered practices. Boys were taught rudimentary agricultural and mechanic skills and carpentry skills. girls were taught the domestic arts is what they were called. So congratulations, here we're talking about the chaining of women to the household yet again.
Yeah.
So patriarchy 101. But this is what the school curriculums were all designed to do. We are not talking about education as liberation here. We are talking about education as a weapon of cultural annihilation. Indigenous identities were castigated as savage. Children were told that their parents were backward, that their communities were devil worshippers, that frankly everything about them was illegitimate in the modern society, and therefore they had to change. And frankly, if they did not change, the teachers and the priests and the nuns, they forced them to change. And physical punishments were common at residential schools. But also it could take the form of physical punishment, could take the form of humiliation. Essentially, what I'm talking about is the colonization of children's ontologies. And some of the things that children need the most, like the ability and the freedom to just go out and play and be themselves and create their own identities, that was stolen from them. And when you think about the cycle of parenting and children and just the long connections that we have in human history, you generally learn how to be a parent or how not to be a parent based on your parents. And then you take that knowledge, and when you have kids, if you want kids, then you become that parent that you want to become. And then your children, they'll interpret your parenting practices, and so on and so on and so on. And hopefully we're getting better parents and better children out of this whole process. It's a circle of life, if you will. For one survivor, however, Theodore Fontaine, who actually just passed last year or the year before, unfortunately, he wrote an autobiography called Broken Circle. And he said, instead of being part of that parent-child relationship, that healthy parent-child relationship in Indigenous communities, all these children who went to the schools were hate, self-loathing. They were taught how to harm others. They were taught that physical punishment was common. That's how you deal with problems. And they were taught all of these wicked, wicked things by their priests and teachers and nuns. And there was rampant mental and physical and quite disgustingly sexual abuse of children in these institutions. And this is what children learned. This is what parents do. They then often turn to alcohol and other substances to kill the pain, as many survivors do. This is a common thing. One can't stand in judgment at all. And then that breeds its own problems, and then they have kids. And then you could have multiple generations of families going to residential schools. And for Theodore Fontaine, that was his experience. And he said this was a broken circle of parent and child. And instead of learning love, they learned hate. And they learned how to be, awful parents. Because of the residential schools. So when you hear people talk about Johann Galtung's cycles of violence idea, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about vicious cycles here, how a bad idea can spiral out of control, and a genocidal idea can have wide-ranging ramifications decades afterwards.
So how would you... I mean, it's easy to look back on the Trudeau government and how they handled it, and I think it's much easier to look back on it and go, oh, this is what they should have done. And I'm sure you have opinions on what they should have done. And I'd like to hear those, but then I'd also like to know what should be done now on both, I think, a governmental, and then we can also get into a personal level. But I think start with what should the government have done? What should have Trudeau's government done? How should they have handled it and gone with it?
Well, I'll start that by asking a question. What year were you born?
2006.
2006. So you were born 9 years after, oh, sorry, not even that. You were born, the last one closed in 97. So you were born 11 years, actually, just after the close of the final residential school. I was born in 89, so here we go. I got the 19. I'm from the 1900s, as you guys say. Of which never say that to somebody born in the 1900s. But this is not this is not some far off distant past that we're dealing with here, right?
Yeah.
So as I said before, there were about 80,000 survivors of the residential schools still alive at the time of the TRC. There's a process that we should talk about, and then I'll actually answer your question directly. There was a reparations program as well, paired with the Truth Commission. It's called the Common Experience Payment Program, and there was also an independent assessment process program. And both of these were designed to give money to survivors. So here's the reparation that somebody could have gotten for surviving a genocidal institution in Canada. Buckle up. $10,000 for the first year that it had to be a survivor that proved that they were forced to go to a school, and then $3,000 for every subsequent year.
Yeah,
that's not a lot of money.
That does not seem very fair.
Enter into the independent assessment program, the IAP. It was designed to give top-up money for victims of abuse, whether it be physical, mental, or sexual. And there were significant payouts made, but not to the degree that one would hope by any means. When you problem of reparations, you're putting value on human suffering. What is it? What is it? What dollar figure are you comfy with? So, we had this reparations program, but it was limited in scope, and it was quite damaging to survivors, if I'm being honest. That survivors, they were the ones who had to prove everything.
Yeah.
And because the TRC couldn't subpoena anybody, they couldn't get any real story out of any accusations here.
Wow.
So it was re-traumatizing for survivors, and a lot of claims were denied, mainly because the government did what the government always does when anybody commits an atrocity. You burn the paperwork.
Yeah.
Or better yet, in Canada's case, if I'm really going to cook your brain right now, Canada is the one that started the TRC at the governmental level. And then the government sued the institution or the TRC had to sue the government, rather, for paperwork that was promised to it from what was termed Indian Affairs and is now Indigenous Affairs. But the government withheld paperwork because it didn't want to give it over. Moreover, IA, it had destroyed hundreds of thousands of documents beforehand.
Wow.
So you have all of these weird processes happening in the background. Enter Justin Trudeau in 2015. And this shiny new list of 94 calls to action, of which the vast majority are not even started. There's a think tank out of what used to be Ryerson University, is now Toronto Metropolitan, called the Yellowhead Institute. And I think their number is that 81 out of the 94 calls haven't even been started.
Yeah, I think wasn't there a website that we looked at in PO 101 that was like, if it showed like if it had been started, what's been done, and if it was done, and it just was most of them not even been started or touched or anything.
It's a joke.
And then the ones that had been started were like maybe halfway done.
Yeah. So what should have been done then? This is the big question then. So what should have been done? What should have been done is in 2015 there was seemingly a significant appetite for reconciliation activities. Public opinion polling from the time showed that about 70% of respondents in various surveys, they could correctly identify that the residential schools were genocidal in nature. You even had a ton of people signing on saying, yes, something needs to get done. So there was the political capital. So even pre-COVID, Trudeau had a good chunk of time to get stuff done.
Yeah.
Just didn't. Because I think your listeners need to wrap their heads around this, that reconciliation, it is not just a partisan problem here. Like, no political party can claim hegemony on being the good guys, if you will, on reconciliation.
Yeah. Because
all these political parties, they are part of the settler colonial framework.
Yeah.
And yeah, sure, we are a liberal democracy, absolutely. But for one of my friends, who's a scholar at a university who shall go unnamed, they said Canada is a liberal democracy for 96% of the population.
Yeah.
But for 4 or 5% of the population, Indigenous population, it more resembles an authoritarian regime. And that exists to today because the Indian Act is still very much alive and well.
Yeah.
And it structures everything. So what should have been done is a robust, comprehensive program aimed at justice. Now, I am not going to sit here and have your listeners think that I am some pie in the sky, totally progressively minded person who is bereft of political pragmatism. I know that every single transitional justice effort that has ever been accomplished, it does not accomplish all of its goals.
Yeah.
But they at least try.
Yeah.
And the lack of effort in Canada is something that one has to stand back in awe at, that it is so easy to offer a land acknowledgement. It is so easy to wear the orange T-shirt. It is really difficult to say the healthcare, educational, and correctional institutions in this country have been used as weapons against Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
We need to fix those institutions. Nobody's taken up that mantle yet. And yes, Canada has signed on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's nice. It still has the Indian Act. And there's been little effort to actually re-up on treaties. And by that I mean a number of treaties from coast to coast to coast, which are the things that are the basis for ownership of land in our settler perspective. There are a number of treaties coast to coast to coast that still pay out the monetary valuation that was assigned in the 1800s. So, if you were promised a $5 payout in the 1800s, that's still what you're getting in 2025.
That's crazy.
These things have not been updated.
Yeah.
But it should come as no surprise because everybody in politics in Canada, unfortunately, they have the duty to uphold the settler colonial framework. This is what this country is. And I'm not some Canada hater by saying that. In fact, I would define myself as a virulent patriot, a strong patriot. But as a patriot of this country, I can recognize how awesome it can be. I can also recognize the wrongs of this country.
Yeah.
And I can recognize that things need to be done.
Yeah.
So the things that weren't done are so numerous that we'd be here for the next 5 hours if we really delved into it.
Yeah.
But needless to say, it's been half-hearted efforts right now, and there's been a lack of genuine leadership, and that has been extraordinarily troubling for somebody like me on the sidelines here.
Yeah, I think I think first I would just want to say that I think a lot of people when talking about this get very self-conscious about it.
Oh, totally.
You're saying people are going to think that you're a Canada hater, but being patriotic, I think you can love your country. I love Canada, but I can look and see the faults that Canada has. I can see the problems that Canada has and where we're doing bad, but I can also still love Canada and love my country. And cheer on Team Canada and the U.S. becoming the fourth territory.
Yeah, absolutely. Not even a province of territory. Yeah. I love it.
But I can still reflect and be like, okay, yeah, Canada did a lot of bad things, and I think there's a bit of I don't know what to call it, not like a disconnect, but something there for people where they get very defensive about it and self-conscious about it. And I think you using the term settler colonialism. Yeah. And I think if you can kind of define what that means for people who might not know. Sure. And then also moving forward, how can we do this without, because I don't think the right way about going about it, and we kind of talked about this before, is not blaming people now. It's not your fault. It's not my fault, but we can acknowledge that we have benefited from the system.
Absolutely.
And what do we do going forward?
Yeah. I think that idea of not blaming people now is really important, because I do wonder if people really put their guard up because they're worried about being accused of something.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not totally outside of social media. I know cancel culture is a real thing, and I know people may be worried about being canceled for saying the wrong thing. But I have to say, learning, it requires you putting your foot in your mouth now and then and learning from it. And, it's about having a little bit more intellectual honesty with each other and just saying, I'm going to misstep. I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to correct that. I'm going to learn from it. Not in a forced way, but I'm really going to give this an honest try. So, I mean, when you when you think about settler colonialism, let's go to that first.
Mhm.
Settler colonialism, it's one of the types of colonial control. That you could have direct colonial control, which is sort of like France over Algeria, where you have all the orders coming in from Paris and French troops in Algeria commanding the Algerian population. You'd have indirect colonial rule, like the British Raj in India. Where certainly the dictates still come from London, but you have locals who rule in your stead or on behalf of you. You could have economic companies like the Dutch East India Company, which engaged in slavery, the enslavement of peoples to an incredible degree. Same with the British East India Company. Or Hudson's Bay Company, for that matter, which is still around. And then you've got settler colonialism, which is unique because all the other forms of settler colonial colonial control, it's usually purely militaristic or economic in nature. Yes, settler colonial is that, but then some, because now you have people coming from the home country to another one, and they intend to stay. They're not there to just open up a mine and get those resources and then go back to the home country.
Yeah.
They are there to stay and set up new cities and continually expand. That, for one Indigenous scholar, Patrick Wolfe, says settler colonialism, it operates on a logic of elimination, that the elimination of Indigenous peoples is at the core of settler expansion, that it is unfortunately a bit of a zero-sum game here. And settler colonialism is all about land. So if you want to keep on expanding, you need land. You are going to come into collision, not just contact, but collision with other people, Indigenous in this country. You're going to want their land by some way, shape, or form. And then in come all those different types of treaties that we have. So settler colonialism, it's this creeping process of expansion, if you will. And I know I've read this before, and there are a number of public figures who have espoused this in recent years. Actually, I've actually got the book at home on my shelf, unfortunately. But there are a bunch of people who deny that the residential schools were genocide.
Really?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. There's a robust denialist network in Canada. We can unpack that if we got time. But one of the things they'll assert is, settler is a racist term, which drives me absolutely mad. That settler and Indigenous, those are just two categories of the colonial project here. That you are either Indigenous or you're a settler. That's it. That's the main dividing line when it comes to reconciliation. That there are immense variances within either category, though. That there are scores of Indigenous nations. There are well over 600 different Indigenous nations in Canada, spread across 2,600 reserves. Now, fun fact you can whip out at a party sometime. You can fit all 2,600 of Canada's reserves inside of 2/3 of the largest reserve in the United States. So this is not a lot of land we're talking about. This is small postage stamps of control over populations. So there's a lot of variance within this Indigenous category. There's also a lot of variance within the settler category. And you alluded to Black Lives Matter before, and it's important to point out that, yes, there are absolutely racial or religious or ethnic or any type of, or gender, sexuality, whatever it may be, these different categories of people within the settler analytical framework, and there are power differentials. But for the purpose of reconciliation politics, it really is settlers versus Indigenous peoples.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I know has been stated quite a bit, unfortunately, is, well, my family just came over in the last 20, 30 years, even 50 years. Let's expand the scope. We never participated in any of this. Why are we responsible for it? So this is sort of a classic denialist statement, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I don't blame people for thinking that way. I don't think people deny necessarily always out of malice. I think people can innocently fall into a denial. But that idea that, you didn't take part in the residential schools specifically, sure, absolutely. I can buy that argument. But as we are talking about an institutionalized process here, as we are talking about the foundation of Canada, when you come to a country, you accept everything that it ever was, and you inherit everything it's ever going to be. And part of that is you inherit all of it. You inherit the good the bad, and the ugly, which is also one of my favorite films. But you inherit it all, and you have to play a role in making amends for the wrongs of the past, as well as enjoying in the good of the present as well. So, I mean, there's a lot to unpack with just that alone, but generally speaking, everybody shares in this reconciliation politic.
Yeah, I think like and we can get a bit more into this of people and how they deal with it. Like for me, for example, I know that obviously it's not my fault for everything that happened.
Totally.
But I can reflect and be like, well, yeah, that's bad. And there are some ways that I probably don't know of that I'm somehow benefiting from this, and it's bad and we need to go forward. But how do we go forward? Obviously we need governmental change and like reform there and stuff like that. But how do we go forward on the individual level? Because I think there are a lot of people, like with the land acknowledgements, I think we can say that's an individual level of like,
Totally.
It is a little structural of like, everybody does it, so everybody does it.
Totally.
But it is on an individual level of like who actually decides to do it and whatnot. But then also like I've had some teachers who have had, I think, good intentions, and I told you about this before, but have had good intentions of wanting to bring awareness to it, but then fail because they are trying too hard, I think is the way I can kind of put it. Of my friend had a teacher for grade 10 history where you're supposed to learn about World War I a little bit and then a lot about World War II and how Canada fits into that. He didn't learn about World War I or World War II, and his teacher focused solely on Indigenous people in Canada and how they fit into World War I and World War II. So he did learn about it a bit, but not the like why World War I happened or anything like that. And she referred to Canada as Turtle Island and stuff like that. And she clearly has she has good intentions of wanting to do better and like reconcile and be like, oh yeah, we did wrong, like we need to learn about this. But it is to a fault, I think.
Totally. I get it. There is such a thing as a monomaniacal focus on one thing. And that's never a good thing necessarily. You know, it is important to focus on reconciliation, but it cannot be the only conversation we're having. Yeah. Because if we do allow that to happen, then you're correct in pointing out, well, what about all these other histories? And frankly, if I'm being honest, as a historian in political science clothing, you need to have a robust understanding of these different historical processes and how they intersect with each other. I mean, to go to the residential schools specifically, you could not possibly understand why the per capita grant increase for students that were the governmental grant to the schools themselves, why the increase of the early 1900s had limited effect unless you understood the food shortages, the material shortages, and just the idea shortages that were present in the First World War, the Great War, and the Second World War, and the Depression era. You can't understand the residential schools unless you understand the broader context. Yeah. So you need a robust understanding of all of this. You know, oh gosh, I had one thought, but I'm still formulating it in the back of my head. You know, I think justice takes place on multiple levels, especially this reconciliation stuff. And I would not blame anybody for throwing their hands up in despair and going, oh my God, it's so complex. I don't, this is the wicked problem. That it's so complex, it's so interconnected, I don't even know what to do. And moreover, I think one of the most damaging things that's out there is, even if I do something, it's not enough. Yeah. I want to push back against that a little bit. That, yes, I fully recognize what I'm about to say is going to fly a little bit in the face of what I said about land acknowledgements. But reconciliation should work on the discursive and the material levels. That we need things like land acknowledgements. We need teaching of reconciliation. And we need, moreover, like after this, I'm going to go and teach my North American genocide class. And we're going to examine genocide in Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And we're going to peel back the Band-Aid and see what's really under there. It's important we do that so you know exactly what the justice effort is and why it's important in the first place. Yeah. But anyways, Reconciliation works on multiple levels. This discursive and material level. It's important you have the discursive act, but you have to back it up with some sort of material action. Because when you think about just material remedy, like if you just provided a reparation, let's say, or you just provided a structural adjustment program or something of the sort, but you didn't have any sort of discursive whipping of public opinion, then it's just action without meaning.
Yeah.
So you actually need a harmonization of all of these efforts, of the discursive and the material together. So the discursive, it reinforces the material, and the material reinforces the discursive. So you need a robust set of action here. And believe me when I say, it's enough to do the discursive stuff. It's enough to go out and learn about some of the histories. It's enough to then become lightly involved in some of these processes, even if it is just as simple as writing your MP, your MPP, your local representative, and saying, look, this is important to me. We need to be doing this. Because individual citizens, in the framework we have, we can't unilaterally change anything. Treaties are between the Crown and Indigenous nations, aka the feds and Indigenous nations. I don't control the federal government. You don't either. But as voters, we can impact the federal government. We can impact the provincial government to forward specific programs as well. So there are a lot of little reconciliations that we can all be doing that forward the discursive and the material, just in an indirect manner. So you may not be going out there with pitchforks and torches and screaming, let's go do this. You'll be doing it in a more polite manner, how very Canadian of us. And it's going to take time, but it's the path to durable change. Because the fundamental problem we have in Canada with reconciliation, I said that transitional justice is about rights violating rule to rights respecting rule. We were kind of rights respecting rule beforehand too, just not for Indigenous peoples. So Canada, it's less transitional justice, and it's more about justice without transition. So how do you seek redress for something that a liberal democracy, supposedly one of the best political systems out there, for human rights, how do you seek redress in that? And for that, I could only say, use the liberal democratic system against the liberal democratic system and fight for change. And it's going to take time, but that's okay. It'll be durable.
Do you know Sauble Beach?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Quite well, actually.
Yeah. Do you know like what has happened with Sauble Beach and the band there?
Yeah, just a little bit.
Yeah. So because my family, we have like gone to Sauble Beach a lot. We now have a cottage in Port Elgin.
Oh, very cool.
And my grandparents, like I used to go with my grandparents. We would rent a cottage. Like my grandparents and my cousins to Sauble Beach. They now have a cottage as well. But the growing up, and I have now, with reconciliation and everything, the band got a strip of land that they were promised. And it turned from these nice cottages that had like they were on like a bit of a cliff, and then you see out the lake. It then turned into, well, you don't actually own any of it. You can't, and then there were like all these rules and everything. And like people obviously have like mixed opinions about that. I think people's main opinion, if you own it, is like, oh well, they just ban you from going during the winter. Like you're not allowed to go on your property during the winter or anything. And that you don't own the land, that the band owns the land. Obviously, because they have been promised it, but now the people who originally like bought it, I think their like property value dropped and everything. And all that stuff. But then the Sauble Beach government has had several legal battles with the band of not wanting to give up any land and money and stuff like that. And they have continuously lost when it goes to court. And like part of Sauble Beach is now turned over to band control and stuff like that. And it's been very, very interesting and kind of funny because of the mismanagement, I think, of the Sauble Beach government of, I forget her name, but she is like hates them and has tried to fight back against them and doesn't want to give up any land. and just the mismanagement that has happened and has taken them to court. And it's like, you're obviously not going to win.
Yeah.
You don't
Yeah.
have like really any authority to say that they don't get the land or what they do with it or anything. The judge is obviously going to side with them,
Yeah.
but they have continuously fought against them. And it's been interesting and somewhat amusing to see it happen in real time of like, this just wasn't a thing before. Not that I didn't know of, at least obviously I was much younger, so maybe it was, but then seeing it of like, okay, this is now like Indigenous owned land and there's now these rules that people have to follow and it's changed, and then local government trying to meddle in it. And like, yeah, I was kind of wondering if you knew more about that and if you knew anything about that of like kind of a local, not local level, but a bit more of a local level to like give people an idea of kind of what happens. And like what has happened. And then also just of like, I don't know, just seeing the change. I think that is one area that I have seen like actual real change happen of like, oh, this is, I don't want to say the band is like a government, but like some institution now owns this and is like fighting for their rights and trying to get back what little they can from what was taken from them.
Yeah. I'll start this with that the treaty processes themselves, incredibly asymmetric right from the get-go. And as settler colonialism is all about land, it is unsurprising to see individuals and governments and even communities become absolutely paranoid about the loss of land.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just part and parcel of who we are. Not saying that's a good or a bad thing. It's just, it is what it is. It's the reality.
Mm-hmm.
People are really fearful about losing land, I think, at the core.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a long-standing belief and by this process that's been playing out for the past, 400 years.
Yeah, I think like people are a lot more okay with the government paying out money rather than handing over land, because then it affects people of like, well, now my property value has dropped and how am I gonna sell my cottage, which is an investment, and all that stuff.
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of those forefronts of how do we learn to live together?
Mm-hmm.
And for too long, it's just been settler dominated, that we've dictated terms. I'm not saying that Indigenous nations want vengeance or revenge by any means. I think if anybody wants durable and lasting solutions, it's the Indigenous nations themselves. For settlers, it'd be fine for many of us to just brush the issue aside and walk away. The system, when you think about it, the system is kind of a perfect bureaucracy that you could go almost your entire life before reconciliation and never think about Indigenous nations or problems that they face. That's the very function of the system itself. I mean, I very, very, not apologetically, but sort of shamefully have to admit that I really didn't know much about residential schools at all until I did my master's degree. And I was an undergraduate in history, for God's sakes. So, and I had already specialized in quite a number of, or I was starting to specialize in genocide studies at the time. So like I had a good foundation, but I had never really dealt with colonial genocide. So that's part of the reason why I've dedicated a lot of my life's work to colonial genocide. But, the Sauble Beach episode, I think it's a good synopsis that you provided. And as it's still playing out, all I will say is this, is that there's paranoia on the Sauble Beach government side. And I think there's a willingness to play ball by, I think it's Saugeen Ojibwe up there. If I remember correctly. Saugeen Ojibwe Nation. I could be wrong on that, so your listeners can fact check me. But I think there's a willingness to play ball. But this is what it's going to look like for a number of decades. That seeing as we have not had any major federal level structural adjustment, it's going to play out on the local and the community level, which on one hand is good because one could say, hey, grassroots reconciliation, grassroots justice, this is good. Let's all hold hands. On the other hand, this is a failure of the feds to do what is right and to do what is really in their purview and their control. They should be the ones who are in here and governing for all people in Canada. they've shown a great hesitancy to do so. They've shown a great willingness to throw it to the municipalities and the provinces and say, you just figure it out. So I think the Sauval Beach episode, there are going to be tons of more of these popping up around Canada, centering around land and who really has the right to be there. You know, it really is, like I said, it's a process of learning to live together. It's a process of learning that we've all benefited from this system as settlers, and maybe it's time that we do some sort of remedial action here. Not out of a sense of placating some sort of guilt, but out of really responding to injustice. You know, Canadians were very fond of saying, oh, if there's a problem, we'll just face it head on. Or my other favorite, we're the nation of human rights. And yes, to a degree. But also I would point your listeners to Canada's actions at the international level to limit Indigenous rights at the UN. There's a great article by Jeff Corntassel on that called Partnership and Action ? It's from I think 2007, and basically said, you know, Canada did everything in its power, along with the other settler colonial bloc, the United States, New Zealand, Australia, to limit Indigenous rights as much as possible. So part of the reason why it's a UN declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples and not a convention, a legally binding one, is because the four horsemen of the settler colonial apocalypse banded together and said, absolutely not. We'll only declare it. So there are these international and national and domestic nation-to-nation problems that we are going to be facing, and unfortunately, I think the future here it might be really haphazard, and on an individual community basis. So you're going to have people who resist, those who really support, and it might be fought tooth and nail, and that is probably going to derail a lot of justice efforts. And I might put forward the argument that maybe that was not that's not outside of the intent. That maybe the intent of all this was to make reconciliation so wildly confusing that people just throw their hands up and walk away.
Yeah, I think it has been very confusing because I think there's so many terms and different language that is used that has changed as well. I think over like a fairly short period of time of what language is supposed to be used and how and where and stuff like that. And then you get people who are on both ends of the extreme of like, just don't care and they, whatever, it's not a problem, don't want to care about it. But then people who, I don't want to say care too much, but are like, if you don't use the exact right term, then you're a bad person. Yes. And I think for the people, for just regular people or normal people, it is off-putting. It's like, okay, well, now you're just calling me a bad person. And I think it's a trend with not just reconciliation, but social like trying to push social progress forward. Yeah, I feel like has been people. I don't want to say people have become impatient because
they have
because it needs to be done.
Yep.
But I think it has gotten to a point where people think it needs to be done too fast.
Yeah.
And so when somebody who is maybe not constantly online or tapped into the news and is just living their life, then sees something, whether it be any social issue, I think, and uses a wrong term or doesn't fully understand it, they get reprimanded for it and then feel bad and then turn against the social change and then go on like, okay, well, I don't care. You're calling me bad. So how do we go forward without that, like without doing that?
Yeah. Okay. Well, to use your guys' terminology, unpopular opinion. But I've been working on this idea of how you progress things for a long, long time now. And I don't have the answer. So I can assure you I am wrong in some way, shape, or form. But here's how I've started to see the world is there's a division between bad allies and enemies.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this before, but I'll allude a little bit more now. There are affected populations.
Mhm.
And these are people who have been directly affected by some sort of political process that's caused harm, and there needs to be some justice done. And it's frankly as simple as that. Um, I don't think that's a highly political statement to make by any means. I think it's just something wrong,
Mhm.
therefore something right. It's a balance. That's called morality. But there are affected populations out there. They are almost always going to be in the severe minority. They are going to need helpers. Enter allies. That there are certain people out there that they join the struggle. And some of those allies, they join it for the wrong reasons. Some of them join movements out of some sort of vampiristic empathy, that they feel themselves as part of the struggle. And oh my God, I want to join the struggle because I want everybody to see how good I am. And it's all about me at the end of the day, instead of about the populations that you supposedly care about.
Yeah.
But then there are also allies out there who are really genuine in what they do. And it's important for those people, and I would consider myself part of that to a degree here, of it's important to recognize I'm never going to fully understand. And for reconciliation here, as a settler, it's my duty to listen, number one, but number two, to speak second. That I am not going to be leading these processes.
Yeah.
I'm going to be supporting them. Then things get a little bit more complicated. Then you've got people who are in the neutral, and they haven't been exposed to a lot yet. They haven't been forced to take a position. And that's sort of where we're at right now, that I think a lot of people, they've never been forced to take a position on reconciliation or on matters of fundamental justice that really matter on a human level. I don't blame them for that. And that's a great population to work with. They're malleable. They're often receptive. These are morally good people. Then you got these populations called bad allies. And this is the unpopular opinion piece that I've been working on. But bad allies for me, these are the people that you can get to side with you on one issue, but not on every issue. A story I always tell is I had a student once, not at this university, but at another one. And they came into my class and they just flamingly did not like indigenous peoples, all the racist terms you could imagine. And I said, tell you what, why don't you come to my office and let's just chat? So instead of judging, I just chatted with this person. And over the course of a number of weeks, this person and I chatted, and all I said was, why do you believe that? And we just kept deconstructing their thought process. And then when you got to an incongruence, I just said, so how can you believe that if you also believe this? They went, I'm going to have to think about that. And they went back home and they did the work themselves. Like, you really want lasting change? You ask people why they think what they think.
Yeah.
And you get them to deconstruct the things that they believe. You don't tell them what to think. You give them the tools to critically examine their world around them. I'm essentially talking about good education right here. That me as a professor, I'm not up at the front of the class ragging on saying, you must think like I do. I'm saying, here are some analytical tools for you. Use them. What do you uncover?
Yeah.
Anyways, so this person goes home and, over the course of a number of weeks, finally get this person around to, I support reconciliation. I support UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Could not get them on other social issues, though. That's a bad ally. They're going to be with you for the issue. They're not going to be with you for all the issues.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. That sometimes people have legitimate or illegitimate objections, but this is pragmatic politics, that you should never make an enemy out of a bad ally because you need their vote. You need their support, because if you alienate them, that's one less person who writes their MP demanding that change should happen. So I'd encourage more intellectually honest conversation and conversations that are a little bit more along the lines of, nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. Nobody in this world can claim perfection. And if they do, run.
Yeah.
Those are your bad allies. Your enemies of progress, those are the people that profess to really deeply care, and then they do nothing about it. Because if your progressives or your reformers are not doing what they're supposed to do, that is progressing things, they are holding back progress. So there's your typology of people in my mind.
Yeah.
That I think we all just need to have a little bit more patience with people and not write them off. And maybe somebody espouses some really terrible views. Who hasn't? Seriously, who hasn't? This thing called life, this is all about learning from each other. And we develop and we change, and that is okay.
Yeah.
It's okay to say that I'm imperfect right now. It's okay to go out on a limb and say something and be corrected. It's okay to be wrong and admit that, and then move forward with your life, given new knowledge. It is wrong, in my mind, to never voice up, and it's wrong to get corrected, if you will, and then shut down.
Yeah.
So, I think we just need to find ways of incorporating all diverse sets of the population in Canada. And I'm talking about identity differences in terms of diversity. I'm also talking about intellectual and sort of partisan predisposition differences as well. It's important to make sure that everybody feels like they have a role to play.
Yeah.
And more importantly, they have power. Because we do.
Yeah, it's been one thing that I've made a conscious effort to not assume things about people, and I think that's seen in politics right now is like the us versus them polarization.
Oh, the polarization
of everything,
is incredible.
of like, oh, you are like, I will. It's a bad habit of mine, but I will respond to what I think is a idiotic comment on Instagram, and I will say something of like, pretty much of like, oh, you're wrong. And I usually always try to ask a question, because I'm like, I try to be very kind, and I'm like, oh, I think you're wrong because of this reason, but then why do you believe that? And then the response is always, you're a liberal, you get your news from CBC.
Oh God.
You are just a bunch of random stuff that I never said I'm voting for the Liberals. I never said my political views. I never said where I get my news. I don't get my news from the CBC. I get it from YouTube, and I read articles, but I don't read one specific news source. I'll just Google something if I have a question, and whatever news article is there, I'll read it. So I have made a conscious effort to not be like that, because I understand the harm of that, of like seeing someone and just immediately going, well, you have an opposing view of me, so you're just a bad person. And I think that is kind of a bad thing in recent history that humanity and I think especially the internet has kind of supported, of like this polarization. And if you don't immediately agree with me, then you're a bad person.
Yes.
Like I did an episode about the NDP, and specifically talking about like the Ontario election. And there was a video that I watched that I brought up and talked about. And then it's a conversation I've had with my dad of how the NDP has somewhat screwed themselves, of they are so far like progressive culturally, that they are losing voter base, because if they even take a step outside of the box that they have put themselves in, and don't immediately, I don't want to say pander, but like don't immediately support their base that they have, their base revolts against them, but then they can't get anyone else new in, because you are so far progressive socially that it alienates people. And we're talking about the like where the NDP used to be.
And you could say the same thing for Trump's Republican Party.
Yeah.
That you have to constantly out crazy yourself.
Yeah.
Because you've invited them into the henhouse, and now the Republican Party is full of foxes.
Yeah, the seeing the infighting that is already happening with the Republican Party, and I think that is going to be Trump's biggest issue over the next 4 years, is the infighting of like all of these people. I was talking to my dad about it, and I was like, these people do not have, there isn't an ideology, and this is what happens when you have one man, Trump, as the figurehead of like, oh, everything that he says is amazing.
Yes.
Similar thing with Hitler, and why once Hitler died, I'm not saying they're the same person, but once Hitler died, who takes up the mantle? Who becomes the second person to follow him?
And do you know who it was?
There was like a bunch of different people.
Karl Donitz.
Oh, really? I thought there was like a few people that were all.
Oh yeah, but then immediately sued for peace because it was game over.
Yeah, but that's what happens with dictatorships. Is you have someone who comes into power, can rally everybody, but then what happens once they leave? It kind of all falls apart.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be Trump's biggest issue, is that he is now trying to come in, has gotten into power, and has all these people, but they all have opposing views. You saw it already with Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk and their opinion on H-1B visas. And then I'm forgetting her name, but it's the woman that bragged about shooting her dog in a book.
Kristi Noem.
Yes. And she freaked out and was like screaming about it on Twitter or X, whatever, and was fighting with them. Elon Musk suppressed her and then like unsuppressed her, and like just already infighting over something as simple as visas.
Yeah.
And so I think that's going to be the biggest problem.
Could you imagine then something like that with reconciliation in Canada?
Yeah.
Is the big problem, because we are talking about a fundamental issue here.
Yeah.
And that would be the worst scenario. That's probably the worst case scenario for reconciliation, is it becomes so incredibly politicized.
Yeah.
That then it becomes liberal garbage or conservative trap, whatever it may be. We've been lucky, touching wood thus far, that no political party has gone fully, like main political party from the big three, they've not gone off the rails.
Yeah.
They all still have to at least pay homage to reconciliation at the base. Like, it's not much, frankly, but it's at least some. Pierre Poilievre, one of his big election platforms was economic reconciliation, and he has a long checkered history on Indigenous issues. Do you know what he did the day before Harper offered the official Canadian apology in the House of Commons? He basically said it wasn't genocide and nobody should care. So, to Stephen Harper's credit, on the day he offered the apology to Indigenous peoples for the residential schools, he forced Pierre to go up in Parliament and offer his own apology for his own statements.
Wow.
So when Poilievre went to the Assembly of First Nations and proposed this economic reconciliation, a number of nations turned their backs on him. Actually stood up and turned their backs, and that part of the reason is the statement from 2008 that he made. 2007? No, 2008. It might have been 2007. Sorry, I'm mixing up my dates. But he's at least got it in his platform that reconciliation does have these economic dimensions to it, and it does for sure. But it's not only economics.
Yeah. And
for the Liberals, it's not only language revitalization.
Yeah.
It's actually both, and it's more.
Yeah.
And, I know we've spent a lot of time talking about residential schools and reconciliation because of those residential schools. But there is a problem in Canadian public discourse, and part of the reason why I really love teaching my genocide course right now is I get to go through everything else that was done. So, reconciliation, the way it's being framed up now and the way public education has worked on it, like your friend with World War I and World War II history, the IRS system, the Indian residential school system, it's been made to be the sole boogeyman. Yeah. And really, quick overcap of it, it's 150 years, so about 1831 to 97, about 150,000 students, and about 139 institutions, let's say upwards to 150, kind of operate on a 150 rule. We haven't even talked about the day school system. The day school system, it's the exact same as the residential school system, only the kids weren't forced to sleep there overnight.
I didn't even know that was a thing.
Oh, yeah, there's a parallel system right there, and that's 200 to 400,000 kids. So that's way more than the residential schools.
Yeah.
We also haven't even talked about the pass system that was implemented in pretty much every reserve, that that if you were Indigenous and you wanted to go somewhere off res, you would have to go to the Indian agent and get a pass. And that Indian agent held all power over you. You can imagine what would happen in such an asymmetric relationship.
Yeah.
All the things that are coming to mind, yes, and then some. We have not talked about how the RCMP, it played a role in shooting Inuit dogs, sled dogs up north. And they did that, and Canada just apologized for it. They did that to limit the mobility of Inuit people, to force them into houses, our type of housing.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about how disease and starvation were used as twin pillars to, quote, clear the plains. That was the policy of John A. Macdonald, and frankly, Wilfrid Laurier also played a significant role in forwarding that, and in forwarding the expansion of the reserve system, and in the numbered treaties that were signed out west. Disease and starvation, they worked hand in hand. That Canada, I know some people, they'll talk about disease, like smallpox blankets and all that. That's not the type of disease I'm talking about here. I'm really talking, because those were used on a very, 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 very limited basis. There's very scant historical evidence for those. But instead, what we do have a robust historical evidence on is that as Canada got Rupert's Land in 1869-70 and expanded westward, then they came in contact with collision with all these other Indigenous nations. What do? Well, you have to get them onto a reserve because you need their land, because the settler system has to expand. So in order to do that, you kill off the bison. And in a matter of 10 years, bison basically went extinct in the prairies. You do that because you kill off the one thing that will give, especially Cree nations, any sense of autonomy. And now they become solely reliant on the government. Yeah. And at their very weakest, after years of starvation and disease, because disease takes root in a community with starvation conditions, after years of that, when they're at their weakest, you do not approach them as a mutually powerful partner in a treaty negotiation. You approach them when they're weak and you're powerful, and you dictate terms as the crown. Yeah. And then once they're on reserve, then you continue the starvation and disease practices. And some reserves, they had death rates of 20 to 50%. So we haven't even touched on that. Yeah. I mean, we haven't touched on a lot of stuff. Reconciliation, yes, it's directly tied to the residential schools, but there is so much more that needs to be reconciled in Canadian history. And I would like to remind everybody that all of this was done in your name. Yeah. If you're a settler, this was done so you could live the life you've got. So tell me again how we don't share in the burden for all these injustices. Yeah. Yeah, it is overwhelming, but it is. I think it's a good overwhelming of just like, I didn't know all of that. And do you know why the focus has been on residential schools? And that's easy. The government wanted to limit its responsibility. Oh, okay. That as part of the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, there was initially an idea of including the day schools. The government slapped that idea down right away because it wanted to limit its financial and discursive obligations to Indigenous nations. So nobody's acting well here. Yeah. Like once you're in, you are part of the mechanism. And that mechanism is violent. Yeah. So what do you do in a situation of justice without transition? Then it really is all up to us to try and forward this stuff. Yeah. Because if we don't, the neutral position is just do nothing. Yeah. And which is inherently violent. Have you ever been down to Six Nations of the Grand River? Beside Brantford? No. It's beside Laurier's Brantford campus. Six Nations of the Grand River. It's the largest reserve in Canada by population. And it's nestled in and among this triangle of Hamilton, Brantford, and Toronto. This is one of the most highly developed areas in the world. I can't overemphasize how amazing we have it in Southern Ontario.
Yeah.
It doesn't get much better than this. This is pretty much pinnacle of human living achievements. You want avocados in the middle of winter? We got them.
Yeah.
You want Great Lakes in the middle of summer? Sure, we got it. You want to do anything? It's here. Okay. The other thing we have is running water.
Yeah.
10 to 15% of all homes at Six Nations of the Grand River have running water. And this is in one of the most highly developed areas of the world.
I thought you were going to say don't have running water.
No.
Only 10 to 15 do.
Do.
Wow.
So you do have to stand back in awe at the silent violence that's being done on the daily
Yeah.
in our name, and we don't know because we're not supposed to know,
Yeah.
because we're not supposed to ask the question. So we should. It's important to be a little contrarian now and then, kick the hornet's nest. One of my favorite stories is Shoal Lake 40 Band, and they're up in Lake of the Woods area by Kenora in Ontario. And Shoal Lake, it's a freshwater lake. When the treaty was signed way back in the day, this band, now Shoal Lake 40 is their name officially, they were moved onto an island. And they had no access to the mainland other than a ferry that would break down all the time. So when Trudeau first came into office, he said, oh, yeah, we're going to build Freedom Road, and we're going to build the bridge over to the community, and we're going to make it so they can get running water. Okay, great. It took them 3, 4, 5 years to do that.
Wow.
So even when we intend to do it, it takes a long time, and it's a lot of feet dragging. But here's the wild part of that story is that Shoal Lake 40 Band doesn't have running water. It didn't have running water. Just about a kilometer south, actually, there are 2 giant water intakes, and they run about 100 kilometers to the west. That's where the city of Winnipeg gets its majority of its drinking water.
Yeah.
So it's just like you really do have to stand back in awe. I mean, it really is. The way I lecture about it is this is not a matrix of colonial control. A matrix, it implies like there's one spider web on the wall and there's one central point that it all comes out from, branches out from. We are dealing with matrices of colonial control. We are dealing with spider web on top of spider web on top of spider web, and there's no one single avenue for redress.
Yeah.
Because of that, it is so important to just seek justice wherever we can and start pulling away and start pulling the threads, and let's see what change we can get, build on that. And unfortunately, it's not going to be a quick process in my lifetime, in your lifetime. It's probably not going to happen. I hate to be the bearer of bad news. But there are 2 options then. One, you can do the way of the ostrich and say, oh well, I'm going to bury my head in the sand. Or you could go out and try and do something about it. Yeah. So I'd encourage to try and do something about it. There's no reason to have despair with all of this. And no point in the early 1940s was it ever really envisaged that there would be a universal declaration of human rights in 1948 at this peak of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. There was no hope for the abolitionists, yet they worked and they won. The human rights campaigners in the 40s, they worked and they won. And that guy I mentioned at the beginning, Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide. So the other part of his story is that he was in Poland at the time the Nazis invaded, and he told his family, look, this is different. We have to get out. And his family said, no, this is going to be another pogrom, a fit of violence over a weekend, and we'll all survive. He said, no, it's not. He fled. His entire family stayed. He went to Sweden, and then he escaped to London. That's where he wrote that book, Axis: Rule Over Occupied Europe. He gets to London, does this, and then at the end of the war in 1945, after he's coined the term genocide and he's pushing for an international convention to ban this practice, to criminalize it, he goes, I need to go find my family. And in 1945, he realized that he was the only surviving member of his family. The rest of them had been exterminated by the Nazis. And in response to that, he spent the rest of his life dedicated to seeking justice and to banning genocide in international law. It's imperfect for sure, but it's something we can work with.
Yeah.
And any little action we do today, other people can build on that. There's
Yeah.
always reason for hope. There, and I am a desperate, not just a hopeless, but a desperate optimist despite it all.
Yeah. So before we end,
Yeah.
I want to ask for the people who are listening, and they clearly are listening to this and are already doing a bit and trying to learn more. But if they want to learn more, what like resources would you recommend? Like books, interviews,
Good
stuff
stuff.
like that. What would you recommend to someone who wants to learn more about reconciliation in Canada?
You know what? I think one of the things that anybody could do very easily is you could read any part of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. It's just a wonderful trove of information on residential schools and colonialism. The same thing could be said of the Royal Commission for Aboriginal Peoples from 1996 and its final report in multiple volumes. In terms of books, I'd probably go with something like David MacDonald and The Sleeping Giant Awakens. I think the subtitle is Indian Residential Schools and the Problems of Conciliation. He challenges the idea of reconciliation, that it's not reconciliation. We're not going back to some happy moment in history because there never was one. We are actually conciliating. We are creating a healthy relationship for the first time. People like that, just you could quite literally Google genocide studies Canada, and there would be so much that comes up. Same thing for transitional justice. There are lots of Indigenous scholars that you should read. There are lots of non-Indigenous settler scholars that you should also read. I'd encourage everybody to read far and wide, and pick the issues that you really care about and become and really get knowledgeable about them. You don't have to be perfect on everything, nor do you have to know everything. You just have to specialize on something. So I would do that. And a total shameless self-plug here. But when my book with Andre Perella comes out next year, and that one's with McGill Queen's University Press, that one's going to be a good one, because we tested settler support for reconciliation, and we're some of the only people in Canada to have done this. So the tentative title of that book with McGill Queen's, it's kind of spicy, so here it is: Shallow River of Tears, Canada's Stalled Paths to Reconciliation, and that should be out next spring.
There you go.
So there we go. And other than that, come and shoot me an email. It's abasso@wlu.ca. Happy to meet with anybody.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Hope everybody enjoyed learning a bit about reconciliation in Canada, and I think it's something to continue talking about and continue pushing forward. It's disappointing that it has stalled, but I think the biggest thing is making sure that it's not politicized and it's not something that is for one party, and it's just something that we need to do and we need to progress forward with and do better than how we have done.
Absolutely. That's perfect.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you.